Welcome to the Essential Tax Podcast with your host, Mishkin Santa. In each episode, we'll take the complex world of tax, all the jargon, acronyms, and stuff that make your eyes glaze over, and explain it in an impactful way to understand the complex and unknown areas. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, thewolfgroup.com. Now, here's the host of Essential Tax Podcast, Mishkin Santa.
Hi, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well today. I am very pumped about this podcast today. I've got Peter Palsen here, who is, he and I think the acronym would be Codehead. We like to talk in our IRS language sometimes. He's kind of cut from the same cloth as me. And we're going to talk about a subject that is very near and dear to my heart, which I'll fill everyone in later on. We're talking a little bit about Puerto Rico and kind of the push there that the IRS has. We're also going to talk about IRS enforcement activity. Peter's going to give us some updates from what he knows there. And then we're going to talk about generative AI, which is a new cutting edge area, not only for private practitioners. I heard a lot about that at a recent conference in Cancun for private practitioners and how the big four is kind of using it, and then how the middle tier companies are using it all the way down to little small companies like the Wolf Group. But Peter will talk about that as well. But before we get into all of that, Peter, welcome to the podcast. Can you give our listeners just some background information about yourself so they get to know you a little bit better before we get going?
Yeah, my current iteration is I work with Frost Tax Law, and I work primarily in the tax controversy area. And the attorneys in our practice, and today, by the way, as you mentioned, we're going down the rabbit hole of generative AI and its potential to reshape the IRS. So I think it's a very broad topic, important topic. But we help, and the reason I'm talking about this from the standpoint of our controversy work is that we help clients who are corresponding with the IRS, and our attorneys often wish for greater efficiency in the IRS audit process. Areas like timely communications, accelerating refunds, clearing up improper penalties. So, Mishkin, is that something you aspire for, the greater efficiency in the IRS? That's kind of a weird thing, two-edged sword kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a double-edged sword. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've seen a client come to me. We had a client the other day, non-filer since 2017, living outside the United States, foreign financial assets not reported, got picked up for SFRs for a 3-year period. That's not the most current years. And I'm kind of looking at this thing like this thing is an international eggshell audit just waiting to be done. And the IRS is just like, yeah, pay the tax, file the returns, be done. We're out, And I'm kind of looking at it like, well, golly, that's not really efficient, but that's really helpful for my client. I can kind of get that one done and out of the bag there. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a double-edged sword, and I'm super interested to hear more about that topic for you and kind of your thoughts there. But before we get into that, let's start with the first big topic, which again, I'm super excited about, and I'll give some background about this here in a minute. Talk to me about Puerto Rico. And let's give some background about Puerto Rico so that people can understand Puerto Rico a little bit better. So Puerto Rico is not a state of the United States, right? It's a commonwealth. Am I correct when I say that?
Yeah, territory/commonwealth, a status nobody seems to be very happy with, but it is the current status. And that gives them the right to levy tax on their own residents on island source income. And as you know, IRC Section 933 exempts that income from mainland U.S. tax. So what you pay in Puerto Rico, if you're a resident, is pretty much it on income tax. And since 2012, what's really made this interesting is that in 2012, Puerto Rico came up with an incentive program that provides relocators from the mainland a 0% capital gains rate on qualified income and a 4% business tax rate. And again, that's all you pay. So it is I saw a web or a seminar notice on this the other day, and it says it's a benefit unmatched in any foreign country. It's an incredible benefit. It's available to all 330 million U.S. citizens, but only in the last 12 years, only 3,700 people have taken advantage of the program and moved to Puerto Rico to claim the investor incentives.
And we know we know the 3,700 because they have to register. Is that right, or they have to do something proactive?
Yeah. In fact, historically, really going back a couple of years, all the names were disclosed of people who you have to get a certificate, essentially, or a contract from the government of Puerto Rico to get these benefits, and the names of all the people that received the certificate were published on the development website in Puerto Rico. So it's a fully transparent program, and like it's being live streamed by a lot of people who are taking advantage of the program. So it's one of the most transparent tax incentives I think we've ever seen.
And that's on the DDEC, right? The Department of Economic Development and Commerce. They're the ones that publish. Or is that no longer on there? You no longer can see that, or
well, they always made it. Yeah, they always made it hard to find it. You'd have to kind of go into some sub bullet on the website, and I tried to find it about a month or two ago, and I couldn't find it. So I don't know if there were some concerns about whether that was disclosure of confidential information, but I don't know if it's just made it like that much harder to find or whether they just quit publishing it. But for sure, it's all known to the IRS. You have to file a form when you take up residency in Puerto Rico. It's Form 8898. And you have to let the IRS know, hey, I'm going down to Puerto Rico. And then you file a contract and you know that too. And so we always thought that there would be controversy in this area. And I don't think that's like something brilliant. It's just like this was an obvious area for controversy. So we've branded in this area for probably 5 or 6 years. I've got a YouTube channel, and I put up a dozen videos. I've interviewed people down in Puerto Rico, a dozen videos on how this program works. And I try to be as technical as possible, as clinical as possible on how this works. And again, despite the remarkable benefits, 3,700 people, Michigan, there are more people at a typical Texas high school football game.
Oh, absolutely.
It's been a very big success.
Yeah. So let's add some more context to this, because from my knowledge, I keep hearing these different things. There's Act 20, which I think is the Export Services Act. There's Act 22, which is the Individual Investors Act, which I think you're primarily focused on. Then there's Act 60. Does that encompass both 20 and 22? Is that the 4% corporate tax? It's kind of hard to keep track of all these different nomenclatures. And so for the listeners, let's just kind of clear the deck on what all these things are and what they mean.
Well, you're right, all the way around. These were originally Act 20 and Act 22, the investor incentive being Act 22, business incentive Act 20. It all got folded together in Act 60 probably around 5 years ago. Act 60 is over 300 pages of lush tropical tax incentives. They are the land of tax incentives. So this is not an outlier. This is just something that's built into their tax system down there.
Got it. So let's focus for a second on Act 22, the Individual Investors Act. Can you kind of tell us what the requirements are to meet that?
Well, there are 2 requirements.
Okay.
Number 1, you have to move to Puerto Rico. You have to really be a bona fide, what they call a bona fide resident of Puerto Rico. Okay. And in a sense, these are somewhat intentionally generous rules, because the idea was Puerto Rico should be able to tax its own residents. So if you define resident very tightly, Puerto Rico doesn't get to tax anybody. So they kind of made this fairly generous, and there are multiple tests you can meet to satisfy the bona fide residence test. And then the other condition is you got to have the right kind of income. Having predictable capital gains is a little bit more difficult than it might seem if you're not an asset manager with carried interest.
Okay.
So like a lot of crypto people have moved, not a lot, but a number of crypto people have moved down. I've talked to them. I had lunch with a bunch of them in Palmas Del Mar last year. And they're down there waiting for crypto, waiting for Bitcoin to go to 100,000 or 1 million, biding their time. Because this incentive only applies to appreciation in assets after you move. So they're waiting for that moment. But we know that crypto goes up and down, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not a stable, like you said, not a stable income source. So let's go back to the bona fide residence test, because this is where I want to kind of give a little personal interlude for a second.
Sure.
So my mother's family is from Puerto Rico. Like all good Puerto Ricans, she was born in New York. My grandfather was an accountant, studying accounting in New York. Amongst many things my grandfather did, but so it kind of runs in the family with me a little bit. But my mother grew up on the island. I used to, when I was a little kid, I used to fly down there and spend 2 months a year down there with my grandmother. When I was in college, I used to go on spring break there with friends. I can tell you, I love Puerto Rico. I love going down there. I love eating the mofongo and the tostones and the food and all that stuff. However, you could not pay me enough money to actually live in Puerto Rico. And I say this with all due love. I've got my uncle lives in Puerto Rico. I've got still cousins that live down there and all sorts of family members. But I would simply, there's no way. Even if you said you're going to live in, some of the
Yeah.
nicer areas, I don't know if I could physically live down there for, to be a bona fide resident. And I think there's issues. If I understand correctly, there's issues with people claiming to be bona fide resident that are not bona fide resident. And then secondarily, there's confusion of reporting the sourcing of income, which is the second test, right? There's confusion of, is it truly Puerto Rican source income or not Puerto Rican source income? There's the dreaded PR 1040, which is the Puerto Rican tax, or maybe it's the 1040 PR, Puerto Rican tax return that I don't think anyone knows how to do unless you're really on the island and you're practicing tax. And we've got a good sister firm down in Puerto Rico, a good Nexia firm down there that does that stuff. So if anyone ever needs help with that, we've got that covered. But can you talk a little bit about those issues and give us kind of the big picture, of what's going on there?
Well, I think that when you talk about like the challenges of living in Puerto Rico during the time that these 3,700 people moved to Puerto Rico, you've had hundreds of thousands of people born in Puerto Rico move to the United States. So it is very fluid back and forth. And I think that some people, this is all personal perspective and how you read the rules. And there's a lot of meme activity going on out here in the Puerto Rico rules. But there is also an interest in trying to get it right. I mean, people, when I talk to them, they're saying like, I'm not going to do this unless I get certainty. And in some cases, I talk to people about, would you jump out of an airplane if there was a 51% chance your parachute would work? This is not something you want to go down there casually without understanding the rules. And my video on the basics of this Puerto Rico incentive program, which has aged very well, has been watched by over 21,000 people, and only 3,700 have actually done it. So I get 21,000 views. The last video I did a couple of months ago, I pretended I moved to Puerto Rico and I tried to do my own tax return based on some hypothetical income streams. Super hard to do. I mean, I have an export service company. I'm doing some consulting. I have to make a decision whether to treat that as a flow-through entity or treat that as a C corporation. I have to figure out the foreign tax credit rules on my income. Some of my income is going to get taxed still in the United States. It's really hard, and your affiliate down there really has an opportunity to mop up in this area, because a lot of people find it hard to get qualified tax preparation advice. And that's not pejorative on people that are doing this. That is just, there is a greater need for people who understand the deep technical aspects of these rules, which is what the IRS is exploring right now with their formal campaign. They have a formal campaign on Act 22 to take a closer look at the investor incentives.
Yeah, and so let's go back for a second to your YouTube videos. Will you send me those links so I can add those to our show notes for everybody? So if they want to check that out, they can easily find it.
Yeah, you bet. And they're short videos. They're like 10 minutes, 12 minutes. They're supposed to be digestible. And again, I get a lot of calls, people that want to understand this. I get calls from people that have already moved that say, what's going on with this program? I already moved. I got my contract. Now I got to figure out how it really works.
I've watched the videos, and I'm a big fan. I would tell anyone out there that if you want to learn more about this stuff, from the reason why I had Peter on the episode today is because he's the super expert, in my opinion, on this stuff. And I think if you have issues related to this, he's a great guy to talk to get some advice. Let's move on to the campaign that you just mentioned. So some context, and Peter, feel free to add in here. But I always tell people when the IRS tells you they're going to do something, for the most part, they're going to probably follow through with it. And part of that, anyone can Google this, and we'll put a link to it on the show notes. But they have these what are called LB&I international campaigns. Used to be back when I was with the service, LMSB, I believe was what the division was called. And IRS got all cute and wanted to become a law firm, so they switched it to LB&I. But they have these campaigns, and they say like, these are the areas that we're trying to look into or we're going after, and this is how we're going to deal with it. And I think it was in January of 2021, they came out with the Act 22 campaign. Can you talk about that and maybe just campaigns in general and your experience with those?
Well, So a campaign is a focused area, focused resources. They have these things called quiet or probing letters. I forget the term. You know the term, but soft letters.
Soft letters.
Yeah, where they say like, and IDRs. We can get into the IRS audit process. I think some people worry that if they go to Crypto Monday in San Juan, that the IRS will be there and start, to audit them on the spot. And that's just not how an IRS audit works, right? So it's a formal process. And so the IRS essentially wraps that formal process into another process, which says we're going to devote the resources. We're going to be on the ground down there, which they very much are. And we're going to get, to the bottom of this and make sure it's being properly used. This is an incentive program. If you just take apart an incentive program, it loses its incentive value, right? So, and then the other thing is they got 3 million Puerto Ricans, people living down on the island that are taking advantage of Section 933 that they don't have contracts. I mean, so they have to find a way to police the contract holders without torching the entire Section 933, which has been around forever, by the way, without disturbing it. Like, how many people who live in Puerto Rico have homes in the United States, second homes in the United States? How many people have bank accounts in the United States? How many people have cars in the United States? How many people have kids in the United States? And so somehow they've got to tease out the part they don't like and leave the whole rest of the 3 million people kind of intact. And that's a challenge.
Right. And so speak to me a little bit about IRS enforcement in this area. I think you went through a lot of really good stats when we previously spoke about this, about chief counsel and IRS enforcement in general. I think this is super interesting.
Yeah. So they opened this campaign, as you said, about 3 years ago, and they started off pretty strong. They arrested the head of tax of one of the local accounting firm affiliates down there, who had done probably more contracts, incentive contracts, than anybody else. And they arrested and indicted him. And then the thing went quiet, just quiet. And I got my ear to the ground down there. Again, a lot of people live stream. A lot of people would have just held their IRS notice up to the camera if they got one. Yeah, it's that kind of place. And none of that was happening. So it's very quiet, unusually quiet. And then around the start of the year, Danny Werfel, who's the commissioner of the IRS and the spokesperson for the IRS, which is interesting.
Very interesting.
Yeah, because he talks about he's commented about generative AI. We'll talk about that later, but it's always Danny, and so he came out and said, as part of an annual review process, that they had about 100 audits working, and that he thought many of those would be criminal, which got a lot of people's attention. And criminal, and this focuses on the bona fide, apparently based on the IDRs, this focuses on the bona fide residence test, which is kind of a strange thing to go for criminal in that area.
Right. And IDR, just to clarify, talking to me like I'm a 3-year-old, that's information document request.
Yeah, that's kickoff of the audit cycle. You get notified. I've never been audited, but you get notified that you're being audited, and then the IRS sends you an IDR and asks you a lot of questions about what you're doing. Again, supplementing the information that's required to be provided when you take up bona fide residence. And so this formal campaign was off and running. Here we have some kind of indication that this is actually happening. And then and then it goes quiet again. And then a couple of months ago, there was a whistleblower letter circulating. And the whistleblower said there were only 20 active audits. 20.
Yeah,
20
that was May 2024, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
20 audits. There was a New York Times article on this whistleblower thing. But 20 out of 3,700, that's like what, 0.5%?
That's nothing. Yeah.
Less than, and so I think the whistleblower was somewhat outraged, not outraged, but surprised that the rate was so low. It's not the end of the audit campaign. So, but the question really is, does that signify some kind of practical limit of how many cases the IRS can get going? Like how much bandwidth they have, particularly in chief counsel, to move 20 criminal cases forward?
Right, because chief counsel is the only one that can do that, right? They can't just give that to some, regular revenue agent, revenue officer. That has to all flow through chief counsel, if I'm correct, right?
Yeah, and the interesting part of this, so what's going to happen here, and we're kind of like dipping into the pond of generative AI, to make these cases, they're going to use bank data, which kind of they've always used. But they could use GPS information. They could use cell phone pings. They could use facial recognition from different airports. How do you get in and out of Puerto Rico? So there's a lot of this new technology that they can bring to bear in these particular audits. And when you do that, you have to make sure you're doing it all the right way.
Mm-hmm.
You're following, you're dotting all the I's, you're crossing all the T's. Or the court's
custody evidence stuff, yeah.
And so one of my videos is called U.S. Tax Law, Made in Puerto Rico. And it really focuses on crypto and how a lot of the determinations, if the IRS were to begin to audit crypto, or even some of the positions taken by the Puerto Rican authorities in applying their incentive regime, establish certain positions in crypto that have really not been clarified already in the United States. And so I think in the same way, the IRS, when you're talking about some of these particular issues, maybe inversions, maybe Section 367, a lot of issues involved, sourcing, characterization of crypto assets, and these sourcing rules, which you and I have worked with for decades, and how complicated they can be.
Yep.
And you're trying to apply that all in the context of this IRS campaign, and you're going to end up breaking some new ground. And so in a sense, you've got to think about what's called hazards of litigation that you're aware of. Like, am I doing something in Puerto Rico for 20 people that is going to somehow destabilize the entire area, crypto area, whatever? And I think that's maybe a reason the IRS is going a bit slow on this, if it can be said they're going slow.
Okay. And do we think that there may be, and now this is really tangential and off topic, and please do not spend a ton of time on this unless you really want to, but do we think the recent Supreme Court case in Loper Bright has any impact on that, or will have any impact? And then just so for everyone's knowledge, that's a direct kind of change to U.S. law based off of the Chevron doctrine. And I've talked about that in my last podcast on the June 2024 Hot Topics. I'll talk about it again in my next one for July. So if you want to learn more about that, and we're going to have someone on to talk about that as well. But any commentary on the kind of coming train against IRS regulations and how they put those out?
Well, I think it relates to another point I'm trying to make, which is really part two of the three-part story. And that's the impact on IRS efficiency. Because when you're talking about deference to the IRS regulations that is now being challenged, you're talking about court cases. You're talking about legal challenges. You're talking about chief counsel again. And is this going to just pinch that bottleneck with respect to the entire efficiencies of the Internal Revenue Service?
Yeah, I mean, how many people at chief counsel do we have down there now? How many, do you have the stats on that?
Yeah, I do. So Margie Rawlinson, one of my former partners, love her, and she said in probably month old. She was up in New York working on a conference, and she said that they have increased, I think, from 2,700 people to 3,400 over the last year. So the IRS is getting more money, it's getting more budget, it's adding more people, and she said they've been able to increase by 30%.
Okay.
So the question is, do the number of audits in Puerto Rico go from 20 to 26? That all seems very incremental. And not only that, like if we can segue into part two of this,
Sure.
Which is kind of comparing that 0.5% rate to the overall IRS audit rate now. And a couple of metrics there that I think are useful. I mean, the IRS last year, they conducted about 800,000 audits. Sounds like a lot, right?
It's not.
They get 200 million returns or something, close to that. So that's like 0.4%. And then Janet Yellen,
Treasury
August
Secretary.
22nd, she said in a report, actually a letter to the IRS commissioner, she was talking about the historic kind of focus on high net worth people. And they tried for years. Stephen Mnuchin said we should audit 8% of high net worth people. And Janet Yellen said, we don't have the people. We don't have the ability to do that. We can do 7,500 returns effectively out of the 4 million pool. That's like 0.2%. So we keep coming back to this less than 1% metric. And I'm not, it sounds like I'm being critical of the IRS, and I'm not. I think most taxpayers would get a benefit in having more efficiencies in the IRS. And I think there are ways that can happen in a very taxpayer-friendly manner. But keep in mind, too, what's happened to the IRS so far this decade. They started out this decade with kind of a historically low number of employees relative to the number of returns filed. Now they've got more money to add to that. But they also got whacked by COVID. And that hurt them in two ways. Number one, they had to pivot the whole organization to remote work. So before COVID, only 15% of IRS employees were capable, technology-wise and otherwise, from working from home. And after, they came to grips with COVID, that number went up to 85%.
Right.
They had to they had to invert the whole organization with respect to remote work. And it took a long time. And during that process, up to half the employees were sidelined, waiting for the laptops, waiting for the ability to work remotely. And then the other part that COVID gave them, the other gift that COVID gave them, was a whole bunch of new work streams. Yeah. Lots and lots of new work streams. They were passing out stimulus checks and making sure people reported the income. And they had expanded refundable child care credits to dish out. And they had business provisions like extended loss carrybacks they had to react to. And they got 1.5 million employee retention credit claims.
Yes, it's still
And they just recently said 800,000 of those are suspicious and they need to be looked at more closely.
Right.
So they're still burning off these major work streams that came out of COVID.
How long do you think it's going to take them to get through all of that, realistically? 3 years, 3 more years, 5 more years into the decade?
I don't know, but hey, AI can help. Generative AI can help them out.
Yeah, we'll get into that in a second. Let's before we jump into the AI stuff, because I know you're hot to talk about that. Let's just make sure we kind of wrap a nice little bow here around Puerto Rico and IRS enforcement. So, first off, any more comments about Puerto Rico and where we think that's going to go? Because again, I think you had letters from Congress. The 13 congressional members sent a letter back in November 2023 saying, hey, we got to look at this. You got the whistleblower that just came out in May of this year saying we got to look at this. I think there's hearings. So when there's smoke, there's certainly smoke, but like you said, you have constraints with IRS budget. What you said is very on point. I always tell people, if you look at the IRS, imagine the IRS being a business that's operating with the same operating budget since 2010. So over a decade's worth of, the same operating budget, no increase. Let's forget about increase for inflation or anything, but no really increase to their budget. You're losing people left, right, and center to the private sector. You're having a whole swath that's set to retire here pretty soon. So what realistically are we seeing here for Puerto Rico and the Puerto Rico audit and the examination activity and the campaign over the next, call it the next 2 to 3 years? What's your prediction? What's your thought there?
Well, I asked a guy one time who came out of the IRS, and maybe I could ask the same question to you. But I asked him if you walk into the office in Constitution Avenue and you go down to the basement, is there some kind of like safe down there, and you twist the tumblers, you spin the tumblers on the safe, and you open it up, and there's a little book. There's a little book with all the IRS positions, that everybody can like look at and understand.
Yeah.
And there's not, right? I mean, there's just no kind of central knowledge repository. And so it becomes like, who's involved? Have we got turnover, like some different perspective? I attended an IRS hiring event a couple months ago. My mouse was hovering over the submit resume, but I attended this event and they had like 500 people on it, and they had some really good questions and answers. And somebody said, and it was focused on revenue agents. And somebody said, if I'm going to be a revenue agent and I get a return, am I told what to look at, or do I just kind of poke around and figure it out? Yeah. You kind of feel around on it. And the person from the IRS that was running it was a breakout room, and the person that was running the breakout room said it's more the latter than the former, which I was a little surprised with, and maybe generative AI will change that.
Yeah.
But when you're asking about like what is the future of the IRS campaign in Puerto Rico, like who knows? I mean, despite Congress just pounding on the IRS to try to get information like about what's going on, and they're just like, hang on. But who knows? Like, right?
I think also, and you mentioned this when we talked last, Peter. They have a competing interest, right? I mean, so there's conservation easements, there's this employee retention credit, there's the multi-QROPs, there's all sorts of other areas that they also have to cover. Big, small listed transactions, dirty dozen. And
what about identity theft? Identity theft is huge.
That's
I got identity thefted on my IRS return 5 years ago. I mean, it's huge. You spend a lot of time trying to prove who you are. In a world where people are giving you fewer information, they're Xing out your social security number on your paychecks, and there's just less ability to prove who you are. There's a bigger burden to prove who you are and less ability. So that is a big focus of the IRS as well. And it just makes things, it's a drag in the organization. Again, I'm not criticizing it, I'm defending it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay, so that's a bow around Puerto Rico for a second. So it's up in the air. It's a big question mark. And I think it really depends. So it really depends on how much resources they end up deciding to put behind it, what priority they give it. Maybe, the squeaky, as they say, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. So maybe if this one squeaks enough, more than say private placement life insurance or ERC or something like that, it could really turn up the heat. Because like you said, I think they have the info, they know the people. It's not like they don't have the data. It's with crypto or digital assets, whatever you want to call it. I think that they're still playing catch up there. Some of these other areas like multi-QROPs, I think that they still there's a lot of data mining and a lot of info and intel they've got to like turn over there from the QROPs providers. I think that's who they're going to go after first there, and then they maybe turn around to the individuals.
And just fundamentally, this is an organization with 200 million customers. Right? 200 million customers. They have 100,000 employees aspirationally.
Right.
They have aging computer systems. They share the Guinness World Record for oldest computer system in continuous use.
Yeah.
And you compare this with like Amazon US, they probably have 200 million customers. They have over 1 million employees, and they have state-of-the-art computer systems. So it starts out not being a very fair fight.
Yeah.
And when you start like adding identity theft issues, $1.5 million ERC claims, it's a huge challenge. They need all the help they can get.
Yeah, I always make the joke that when I was with the service, it was kind of like, I don't know if you've ever seen the Star Trek movie for the Voyage Home, but Scotty's trying to talk to the computer. He's like, "Hello, computer," and they're like, "No, you got to do it the old-fashioned way." And he's like, "Okay, let me get on the keyboard and the mouse. Let me type in, run program one." That's kind of what you dealt with. It was very surprising because it should be a lot more sophisticated, but it's not. And hopefully, with some of the cash influx they have to upgrade their infrastructure, hopefully that's changing for them, just for their employees, for mental, just not having to deal with all the rigmarole there. Okay, let's tie a bow really quick around the overall IRS experience and kind of just general IRS enforcement. I know we've just kind of talked about that tangentially in all this, but where do you see this going in the future? Do you see there being a higher level of enforcement? Does it really depend on how well the Inflation Reduction Act funds are deployed? Will there be an impact from TCJA sunset, which I want to talk about that briefly later on with you, get your opinions there. But, is it really just fluid and we'll see as time moves on? Or do you feel like there's a real action plan there to ramp that up? I personally, the first, I would say 6 months of this year, just from what I've observed from people coming to me with problems, because a lot of people come to me with problems. I've seen a lot more of these correspondence audits on Schedule A, itemized deductions, Schedule
Yeah.
E, Schedule E Part 2, Schedule C. I've seen a lot more of that than I probably have seen in probably over a decade. So I feel like I'm going back to like 2008, 2009, like making work pay credit audits and really, just kind of like, oh, is it a hobby loss? I haven't seen those things in a really long time, or denial of certain itemized deductions. So where do you think we're kind of going with that?
Well, I mean, is that a win going back to 2008? Right.
I,
I mean, that's the thing is like, is
not,
that
not,
the
not for
bar?
taxpayers. I don't know. Maybe not for taxpayers. Maybe for the IRS and the federal government. But
Right.
yeah.
But in our controversy practice, we felt the IRS effects of COVID. Things slowed down.
Right.
What we call the routine controversy slowed down. They abated a lot of penalties. So there was this kind of ebb that came through, which was probably necessary. Honestly, you probably had to jettison a few things just to be able to get through that difficult period. If they swing back up to 2008, I think the question is that, are we comparing that to 2008, in which case it's business as usual? Or are we comparing that, we're the 2020, 2021, or those Hallican days, of being a taxpayer, and you didn't have to worry as much about the IRS poking at you. What's your baseline really, I guess? And are we just talking like incremental changes, 30% more of this or 30% more of that? Or, are we at some point going to get some kind of transformational impact on the IRS, something to really launch it forward? Because I don't from our practice standpoint, we're not seeing transformational. We're seeing incremental. We're seeing maybe that go back to 2008. And I guess that's okay. What do you think?
No, I think there's a chance. So I think it's dependent on all the factors I talked about, but also kind of economic impacts. It depends on how the economy goes. Now, let's pause for a second on this conversation, and let's just quickly define tax controversy for everybody. So in your neck of the woods, what's your kind of definition of tax controversy? Like, what matters does it encompass
I think and maybe controversy is a loaded term, but it's taxpayer interaction or IRS interactions on behalf of taxpayers. We help taxpayers get refunds. That's not controversial. There's already an acknowledgement that we owe you this. It's just trying to get through the process, and particularly in the context of identity theft. The taxpayer advocate's supposed to do a lot of that. It was interesting. I don't know if you saw this in the news yesterday, but the taxpayer inspector, what do they call it? Tax Inspector General.
Yeah.
Is kind of like a watchdog to the IRS, and the taxpayer advocate is part of the IRS. So the taxpayer advocate has got like 96 offices around the U.S. and Puerto Rico. the tax inspector general called all those offices.
Oh yeah, I read this. Yeah,
Two of them picked up the
yeah.
phone.
They don't ever pick
And
up.
that is, like, okay, try to do better. And I asked my boss yesterday, I said, what do you think about a more efficient IRS? And it was like, wow, I got a lot of thoughts on that. And he said, but you know what? It would be nice if they just kind of opened up the communication channels a little bit more, be a little bit more responsive to taxpayers trying to get their refunds, because they end up spending, not that we don't like fees, but they end up spending money with us to get a refund back that should just happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, that's why I think a lot of taxpayers would be pleased that the IRS would pick up the phone and process their refunds, things like that.
Yeah. So in my experience, I got two comments for you. So in my experience, the two parts of the IRS that are really responsive when you call them, or if you have the opportunity to email them, are the IRS Streamline unit. So if you're doing an international amnesty
Yeah.
program, they'll actually respond to you. And then the MAP group that does the treaty stuff, those guys are fantastic. My second comment is going back to our original conversation about controversy and is it comparable to '08 or whatever it is. I was just going to say that, look, as if the economy turns sour and things start going bad for people and you start getting more bankruptcies and more debt that can't be paid, this is assuming maybe inflation stays higher and, the jobs start getting cut. I think you're back to a lot of installment agreements, offers and compromise, bankruptcy, intersections with tax. And that leads to all sorts of other, those are kind of lower level, I guess, tax controversy matters that then that brings about questions about tax preparer regulation and those tax controversy firms that are those OIC mills and all that stuff, which I won't get into right now. But that's where I was kind of going with that. Like, do we kind of go back to those days, which I did not like those days. Those are not, good days for taxpayers or the IRS, or are we going to get to some better state? But for the sake of time, let's go ahead and put a pin in the second kind of bullet point, because I really, really want to talk to you about generative AI. Like I said, I was recently at a conference in Cancun, and there was some really great commentary and discussion we had about this for CPA firms, tax prep firms. We talked about how the Big Four was using this in their audit practices. We talked about, can this be used? I think one of the big concerns we always have in our firm is that, and we really try to guard against this. Someone puts in some data, some very client sensitive data, into like a chat GPT function, that because it links to the internet and then it's forever there, right? And then it inadvertently disclosed and you violated 7216 Internal Revenue Code 7216, which says you can't disclose taxpayer information. I'm very concerned that people are just running willy-nilly with a lot of the AI stuff and not understanding the intersection with IRS privacy and confidentiality rules. And so that I think plays into the threats. So I think there's both sides of the coin. There's how do we use it and how to properly, and then how can it help, and then how is it harmful? So go ahead. This is your opportunity. Give us your story on generative AI and kind of the impact you see it playing.
Well, let's talk first about what is generative AI. And the Financial Times, in an article, a very good article, we could even link it, talks about like how it works a little bit, because it works in a lot of different ways. It's not one thing. But the definition in the Financial Times is software that can create plausible and sophisticated text, images, and computer code at a level that mimics human ability. My definition of generative AI is if you were worried about losing your job to a machine, you're probably worried about generative AI. Because that is a lot of the discussion these days. Now, let's talk about the potential impact to the IRS. And I'm not talking about, at this point, I'm not talking about the gee whiz stuff. I'm talking about things that are already in the market.
Okay.
For example, JP Morgan just rolled out a chatbot, which is a link to an AI model, just rolled out a chatbot to 50,000 employees. And they identified over 400 business cases on how it would improve their organizational effectiveness. Now, the IRS has been a big user of traditional AI for decades, which is basically how they can handle 200 million returns. And they've already started to focus on generative AI. Danny Werfel, the spokesman / commissioner, he likened generative AI in the IRS to having night vision goggles. And I saw there was an ad on LinkedIn last week that I saw where they're trying to hire 70 data scientists around the country. So they've already got the toe in the water on generative AI. And let's look at kind of something you talked about a little bit, which is essentially using Chat GPT for tax questions. And you talked about it from a data security standpoint. I want to talk about it from an accuracy standpoint.
Okay.
And so we're talking about generative AI, or we're talking about tax research. And a recent article kind of tees up the opportunity. It says generative AI systems can digest extensive legal documents, tax codes, and regulations to offer clear, actionable interpretations. Sounds pretty good, right? But is it accurate? I'll give you an example. I had to make a gain recognition agreement for an S corporation a couple of years ago. And I had to determine whether I should make it at the level of the S corporation or at the shareholder level.
Okay.
And so we did a little research. My friend Joe Caliano had written an article about this topic, and it was very useful. And we came to the conclusion.
Great practitioner, by the way. He's really good.
Yeah, he's amazing. And I don't want to pin this on him, but we came to the conclusion that we should make it at the S corporation level.
Okay.
And we did that. Fast forward to this podcast. And before this podcast, I sent that same question into both Chat GPT and Meta AI.
Okay.
And Meta AI versus my WhatsApp, you can just text your question.
Right. And they'll answer it for you.
Yeah, it's great. Both of those models told me I should make it at the shareholder level.
Interesting.
And so I think this is something called a hallucination in the AI world, where it looks good, but I didn't think it's right. And so the question is, how does that compare, or how does my experience compare to the broad experience? And the taxpayer advocate, so tax preparation firms right now have chatbot features that are designed to help taxpayers answer individual tax questions. And a taxpayer advocate cited a Washington Post study that said that up to half of the answers given by these tax firm chatbots were either inaccurate or incomplete. And then there was a Stanford University study that found pretty much the same thing, that 50% of the answers were suspect in the case of ChatGPT. But interestingly, if they looked at Lexis and some of the other firms that are big into the search engine area, and they looked at some of their products, and they found that they were accurate up to 65%. And one of the firms in that Stanford University study really issued a rebuttal based on Stanford's findings and said, our internal testing shows that up to 90% accuracy because of the type of data they have available to populate the system. It's more accurate than Chat GPT. And so, can you imagine giving the IRS giving their revenue agents a chat research tool that's 90% accurate? I mean, I think you could say goodbye to practice units.
Yeah.
That's phenomenal. And then you have other really more proven benefits of generative AI and workflow management and document preparation. So you have a situation where the machines could take over a lot of the audit function, or at least support it. I don't want to get ahead of my skis here, but there is that potential with some products already in the market showing promise to be able to do that. Now, again, before we get ahead of ourselves, I think the IRS faces a significant challenge here. And that is that there is a lot of skepticism about generative AI in the audit process, trampling on taxpayer rights, because you have a taxpayer bill of rights. And I think the IRS, I think this is actually a short-term threat to the IRS. They've been, since 2019, there's been legislation, executive orders, and other oversight directives aimed at regulating the use of advanced analytics and AI within the IRS. And in March of this year, the House of Representatives introduced the No AI in Tax Audits Act.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so there's a lot of people tapping the brakes, and even the IRS itself updated their Internal Revenue Manual a couple of months ago to add a section on the use of AI. And here's the thing: it's like generative AI is a subset of big AI, and big AI has been in use by the IRS for decades. We're talking about algorithms. We're talking about
That's how they do their diff scores for grading a tax return for what the audit, right?
yeah,
What's it called? The other one's the C diff. I forget what the name of it is, but yeah, they have two different ways that they basically score a tax return to determine, and then someone looks at it. Ooh, the diff score is high, and we're going to audit this one.
yeah, and so we could have a baby in the bathwater situation here because people are, in a sense, rightfully concerned about the use of generative AI and machine learning and all that goes along with that, the machines taking over. And a lot of people can't distinguish or don't want to distinguish between, including Congress people, honestly, between generative AI and normal AI, big AI.
Right.
And so if they start putting the brakes on AI because of these concerns over generative AI, are they going to impair some things that the IRS is already doing?
Interesting.
And that's already happened, by the way.
Yeah.
That's already happened.
Wow. That's crazy.
So it could actually be a short-term setback for the efficiency and productivity. Long-term, I think it's pretty easy to say it's going to offer some great benefits. And I honestly don't think anybody at the IRS is going to lose their job over generative AI. I think it's just going to expand like the bandwidth. And again, two-edged sword. I was watching yesterday, I got a Thomson Reuters email about a webcast they did, a little half-hour podcast type thing. And they were talking about how like generative AI is going to turn the United States into Europe, where people can, they didn't say this exactly, but where people can have 30-hour work weeks and work-life balance is going to be amazing. And I think that nobody wants to sell generative AI products on the basis that you're going to be able to fire like half your employees. But like, I think in the case of the IRS, nobody should worry about their jobs. I think everybody can really say, hey, we're going places here.
Yeah, to me, it can only be helpful, especially for their low level of staffing. I think it's like bringing, the 12th man onto the football field, right? You get that additional little push for them. The running joke that we had at the Wolf Group a couple years back was that the AI will figure out just about everything except for PFIX. And so, our staff will have to go in and like they'll just be looking for the errors that the AI makes when they're doing the PFIX calculations. And I don't expect anyone in the listeners to understand what PFIX are when I'm saying that, but I'll just say it's a very complicated, it's one of the more complicated tax calculations you can do for the taxation of, say, foreign mutual funds or whatever. But it's just one of those things where we're like, it will never figure out certain areas of international tax. There's just not enough examples to pull from that are correct. I think that's the other part is that if you're pulling from bad data or your universe starts off with bad or incorrect items and you're pulling from that and that's all if from the AI's point of view it's like, yeah, this is correct, I've looked at it, I've compared, I've done all the and if it's bad to begin with, then the result will obviously be bad. And I don't think in the space that the Wolf Group is in, which is a lot of international, there's just not enough good examples of the international stuff that we do. I think digital assets, crypto, maybe another example of that. Puerto Rico, I think probably the 1040 PRs and the sourcing issues we talked about is so complicated, it takes a lot of brain power, probably not enough good examples there. So I think there's a long way to go before we're talking about AI actually replacing those particular functions. Whereas, unfortunately, for my audit brethren, I don't know, maybe you have different, maybe you think this, I don't know, maybe you don't, but I think the folks doing audit, I think, yeah, it made your life super easy now. I don't know if at some point your job may be at risk in the future. So, I don't know. What do you think about that for audit work, audit and attestation?
I don't know. Again, it's just it's a reliability feature, but there are many versions of this that are in use today and can be expanded. Um, and I want to just kind of say that there are going to be winners and losers here, not just individual employees, but organizations. And to some degree, we see that in the context of Lexis. Lexis has better data
Mm-hmm.
than ChatGPT when it comes to populating their system, and they have articles. People have written, like, Joe Caliano's articles are going to be. And if ChatGPT had that article and that was the only article ever written on the topic, they might come to the conclusion I came to, right?
Right. Yeah.
So it gets back to the accuracy of the data and the confidentiality. I mean, the IRS has got more data than anybody
Yep. More
about
hypothetical,
taxes.
more to go into the bucket there for certain.
They could populate like an extraordinary system, neural network kind of system. But how much of that can they put out there into, how much of that is just not able to get outside the wall and go into a general chatbot feature, even used solely within the IRS? I don't know. I mean, I'm sure that's something they're thinking about and looking at right now, but they have an incredible amount of data. The big four firms, I remember 20 years ago working at Ernst & Young, where they started databasing like all the memos that were issued. And they started like nationally databasing those 20 years ago, because they say, why recreate a piece of research in Dallas that's been analyzed in Philadelphia? We can be so much more efficient. And now you think about that today, and if they have actually databased all of that analysis, and somehow they can avoid the confidentiality issues, which are big, then can they populate their database, and is that going to be a much more effective database or much more effective model than what the second tier can do? And does that mean the second tier are all going to get together and try to come up with their own shared database? I don't know. Maybe that's stuff you talked about in your conference, but I think there could be and needs to be a lot of positioning right now in the industry with respect to these generative AI tools, and that's exciting. It's exciting times, and I think like going back to the IRS, should we be worried about a dystopian future of the IRS where the machines rule and they send out drones to collect unpaid tax liabilities? Is
Oh
that
no!
is that in our future?
I hope not. Don't tell me you think it is.
Well, let
Or
me
maybe
share
you
with you.
do. Okay.
Let me share. The question is, what are the limits of
Right.
machine learning? I'll share with you a joke that Chat GPT created, according to an article in the BBC.
Okay.
Okay, here's a joke. I gave my wife glue stick instead of lipstick. She's still not talking to me.
That's a good one. I like that.
I think it's a pretty good joke, So, or is it a lame joke, or is it like an indicator of like sentient thought that is going to forever change our relationship with the IRS?
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Okay, so we're running out of time here. We're going to close out here in a second. It's been such a pleasure to have you on here and to go through all these various topics with you. Before I let you go, though, and I'm going to be asking this of a lot of folks that are coming through the podcast for the foreseeable future. But as you know, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 expires, or the majority of it expires. Some of it's so-called forever, like the corporate tax is, supposedly not going to change. But the majority of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act will expire on December 31st, 2025. I know we don't know who the next president will be. Obviously, that'll have a big impact on what happens there. But what are your, I'm asking you to be Nostradamus, tax Nostradamus. Well, any thoughts on how this thing may go down? Will we more of the same? Will it continue on? Will it be repealed, replaced? Any thoughts, concerns, points? Any big items you want to raise there or talk about?
Right. Well, I don't know that like this 2025, 2026 is going to be like the big inflection point. I entered this profession way back when you had two major dynamics going on at the same time. You had the advent of the personal computer, the PC,
Okay.
throw away the punch cards, and you had the Reagan Tax Act changes, tax law changes.
86,
I
right?
made an entire career on those two things. I just was in the right place at the right time.
Okay.
My son started his career. He's in his third year, Big Four. And now he's on the precept of generative AI altering the technology landscape and the prospects of a substantial revision to U.S. tax laws. Because I look beyond that and I say, boy, are we ripe as we've ever been to some major change in the way our tax system works. Nobody likes the way it is now. Nobody. And you've got like so much activity, so much activism, like if some of that is directed toward our tax system, I really think that this could be another case where you have the technology and the law change driving a whole lot of careers in this space. And so that's what I'm more excited about versus the 25 and the 26 stuff, which again, I think is kind of more incremental. I really do feel like we're set up for some really big changes.
Which you, if I'm reading between the lines, you think have to be done. There's no choice. We need to move. We need to make those changes regardless of who's in power. There's got to be some updates in these areas to kind of continue rolling with the way things are changing. Is that what I'm gleaning from your thoughts there?
I think there are more people than ever that just are not comfortable with the status quo.
Right.
And I think that if someone can harness that enthusiasm, we just have an opportunity here to do something that we've talked about. I think even Obama in his second term was talking about getting a national sales tax, a value-added tax in place. And then I think Trump was talking about an export, like incentive or tax adjustment or whatever it is. And so there's a lot of consumption, discussion of consumption-based taxes and flat taxes and simpler taxes and stuff. And I just feel like we're really getting close, to the point where somebody does something about that.
Right. Yeah, that takes my mind back to what was the 90s with Ross Perot sitting in the chair with the flat tax and trying to teach us all on TV about it. Yeah. Very, very interesting. Very, very insightful. Peter, it's been such a pleasure to have you on here. Let's not wait too long to get you back again. Maybe we can have you come back and talk to us a little bit about Loper Bright or TCJ or whatever it is. But definitely it's been such a great time to have you on the show today. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me on, Mishkin.
You've been tuning in to the Essential Tax Podcast with your host, Mishkin Santa. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcast, Spotify, and on our website, thewolfgroup.com. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others.